The morning began like any other. A pot of coffee brewing on the counter, sunlight crawling across the ranch yard, cattle stirring beyond the barn. For Wes Carter, mornings carried the same rhythm they had since his grandfather first set boots on that soil in 1952. Fences stood where they had always stood. Rifles hung on the barn wall where they had been for generations, and the oak tree at the creek still marked the line of ownership as it had for 70 years. Stability was the defining promise of this land, which was why what came that morning rattled the serenity in such sharp contrast. From his kitchen window, Wes noticed 3 figures making their way up the county road toward his gate. Against the brightness of dawn, a splash of crimson caught his eye. Mylene Pierce, the newly self-anointed compliance chair of the Green Valley HOA, marching like a soldier in her scarlet blazer, clipboard hugged tight to her chest as if it were a shield. Behind her trailed 2 HOA board members who looked more like prisoners of circumstance, their body language sagging under an uncomfortable duty. Wes set his coffee mug down, suspicion already curling in his gut. Just last week he had installed new security cameras angled to cover every angle of the gate. Some instinct had told him the day was coming when he'd need more than memory to prove what really happened here. Now, as Mylene stationed herself squarely in view of the lens, he found himself grateful for that precaution. He pressed the activation button on the console. Every word, every wave of her pen, every foot shuffle would be recorded, time-stamped, and archived in the cloud. "Mr. Carter," Mylene called, voice sharp like the crack of a whip. Even the casual air of the morning paper tucked under his arm couldn't soften her command. "I require immediate access to your property for compliance inspection. We need consistency with community standards throughout our subdivision." Wes stepped onto the porch, thermos of steaming coffee raised politely, calm as ever. "Morning, ma'am. You're welcome to inspect whatever is visible from the county road, but I'm afraid I can't allow unauthorized entry without proper documentation and lawful authority." The rifles mounted on the barn wall behind him glinted in the sun. They weren't displayed as menace but as an echo of ranch life. Tools like the hay bales stacked nearby and the water pump burbling gently. Still, the sight seemed to rattle her. Mylene pulled her clipboard up theatrically, producing a paper thick with signatures and HOA letterhead printed bold enough to impress the naive. She shoved it against the bars of the gate. "This is your notice of violation for unauthorized agricultural land use and failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. $3,000 payable within 30 days. Wes accepted the document, scanning it with a practiced eye. It looked official, yes, but his decades of working with old deeds and property titles for his genealogy hobby made its flaws jump out like weeds in a garden. No covenant sections cited. No evidence photographs attached. The language bloated and vague. Empty intimidation cloaked in bureaucratic wallpaper. Behind Mylene, the 2 board members shifted uneasily. One studied the ground as though ashamed. The other looked almost relieved that someone had finally challenged the woman's authority. Wes raised his eyes to them briefly, offering a half-smile as if to say, "You're off the hook now." "I'll need to review this with legal counsel," Wes said evenly, folding the fine notice against his newspaper. "In the meantime, you're free to document alleged issues from public areas. But my property line is marked clearly by survey posts. Everything beyond those lines private, as in requiring my permission." He tipped the thermos in a mock toast. "Coffee?" The red in Mylene's jacket seemed to spread into her face. With a jerky motion, she tugged a measuring tape from her hip like a sword and began snapping lengths between fence posts, scribbling furiously into her notes. "We'll see about that, Mr. Carter. This community has standards and everyone follows them." Wes fought the urge to laugh. If she needed to measure fence posts, then she clearly wasn't sure where her authority began and ended. Measurement was desperation disguised as diligence. He slipped his phone from his pocket and dialed the number he knew by memory. 2 rings later came the steady baritone of Sheriff Mark Lewis. "Sheriff's Department," Lewis speaking. "Morning, Mark," Wes said casually as though ordering fence parts. "Got a situation out here with the HOA. They're demanding entry onto private property. Thought you might want to provide professional guidance." Lewis didn't hesitate. He'd wrestled his share of these petty tyrant battles before. His own property had once been harassed by overzealous HOA officers. "Be right there, Wes. Document everything." "Don't let them in." 15 minutes later, gravel crunched under the tires of a county cruiser as Sheriff Lewis stepped out. Tall frame in uniform, presence radiating calm authority. Even the morning breeze seemed to settle around him. He greeted Wes with a nod, then turned to Malene. "Ma'am, what exactly are you attempting to inspect today?" Her speech came fast, rehearsed, full of the same hollow buzzwords: consistency, harmony, standards. Lewis patiently listened, then held out his hand for the fine notice. He skimmed it, his brow narrowing. "This paperwork lacks proper authorization and references. HOA boards can enforce legitimate violations, yes, but they cannot compel entry onto private ranch property without consent or a court order. These markers here," he gestured toward the survey posts, "are law. Beyond that, you have no jurisdiction." The confidence melted from Malene's expression. For the first time, uncertainty clouded the red blaze of her anger. At that exact moment, the radio on Lewis's belt crackled. Unit 12 reports of survey markers being disturbed. Possible tampering. His eyes sharpened as he studied the scattered measuring tape, then looked directly at Malene. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "have you or your associates moved, adjusted, or tampered with any markers today?" The question lingered in the quiet morning like smoke from a brush fire. The board members visibly stepped back from her side, cutting distance between their reputations and hers. Malene clutched her clipboard tighter, face pale beneath the makeup, words failing on her tongue. And in that stretched, uncomfortable silence, Wes Carter realized this wasn't about a $3,000 fine. This was about authority unraveling, and the first crack in an empire that thought it could bully him into submission. Something far bigger had just begun at his front gate. 3 days after the gate confrontation, the so-called fine notice still sat on my kitchen counter, glaring at me like an unpaid bill I knew I'd never owe. It wasn't the money that bothered me. It was the principle of it. The arrogance in those clipped words printed on HOA letterhead. Something in my gut told me this wasn't a one-time confrontation. It was the start of a campaign, one where truth and jurisdiction would matter more than posturing. I knew if I wanted to withstand whatever was coming, I couldn't just argue at the gate. I needed facts. Proof written in ink long before any of these HOA dreamers arrived. So at 8 sharp, I pulled my truck up to the county courthouse. The old building carried that timeless smell of paper and dust, where the walls held decades of arguments and resolutions written down in permanent record. The county clerk, Martha, had mediated land disputes since I was a boy. She'd seen cattle fencing fall into neighborhood boundary lines, irrigation canals spark fistfights, and surveyors earn their pay 10 times over just to keep peace between stubborn ranchers. When I stepped up to the desk, she gave me the same half-smile and wry nod she used to give my father all those years ago. "Morning, Wes. Heard you had a run-in with the HOA crowd. Looking for records?" "Looking for proof," I said, and explained what had happened. Martha pulled out an oversized keyring, walked me to the cabinets, and pointed to the cracked leather deed book sitting heavy on the shelf. "Your grandfather's purchase in 1952 is in here, volume 14. The HOA and corporation filings are in the county development boxes, mid-90s somewhere. Start there." The hours that followed felt more like detective work than research. I sat with sunlight streaming across the table, flipping through pages that smelled of dust and permanence. There it was, 1952 in stiff legal handwriting. Henderson Estate grants to John Carter 240 acres, including mineral rights and perpetual easement for county access road. I followed my finger along the legal description, each phrase anchored not in surveyor jargon but in landmarks I could see with my own eyes. Beginning at the large oak tree beside the seasonal creek, it read. That oak still stretched wide just behind my barn, following north along the old fence line. That fence, rebuilt and mended for 70 years, was the very line Malene had paced indignantly with her tape measure. But the most telling language in that deed was about the road. My grandfather had granted easement specifically to the county for maintenance and emergency access, a safeguard for fire trucks, ambulances, or county graders. The easement made no mention of homeowner associations. No clause for private citizens or compliance inspectors, just county and emergency vehicles. The boundary was crystal clear. What rights existed attached to the county, not to any future community standards board? I turned next to the 1995 subdivision documents. The developers had stitched together their shiny Green Valley estates without thorough research, apparently, because what I found was sloppy at best, deliberate omission at worst. Several critical pages were missing from the original submission. The plat map they attached to their HOA and corporation filings showed borders that reached farther than the county's actual surveys. In effect, their map had swallowed parts of the Carter Ranch whole, as if ignoring history would change ownership. Whether it was incompetence or corruption back then, I couldn't yet tell, but the result was the same. The HOA had grown confident enforcing power it never legally had. The deeper shock hit when I pulled Malene Pierce's employment history. Public officials in Texas left trails, and sure enough, her file showed termination from the Dallas City Compliance Department in 2019. The reason? Exceeding authority, improper fines, unauthorized enforcement actions. It was almost word for word what she was attempting here. She had been cast out once before for her crusade of overreach, and rather than change course, she had simply relocated to a quieter county, where she assumed no one would dig deep enough to find her past. By noon, I sat in a pile of certified copies, photos of deed descriptions, and photocopied subdivision mistakes. When stacked in order, the truth was plain as sunrise. My family had been here first, legally and permanently. Our rights were explicit. Our deeds anchored in landmark trees and iron survey stakes placed by county hands. The HOA, on the other hand, was a newcomer barely 30 years old, with paperwork as shaky as the morality of the woman fronting it. They had trespassed into authority they never owned, inherited mistakes from careless developers, and doubled down with the aggression of a compliance chair who didn't know when to stop. Back at the ranch, I spread the documents across my kitchen table like puzzle pieces, each one locking into the next. The patterns spoke clearly. 1952, lawful ownership, explicit easements, survey markers still buried in the earth. Showing corporation sloppy maps, missing pages. Malene's past termination sealed in an official stamp. The pattern wasn't random. It was systemic. A story that said, "These folks are bluffing and you've got 70 years of proof in your corner." I leaned back, coffee thermos in hand, staring at 3 generations of history captured on paper. My grandfather had written his protection in legal phrases. I had the burden of making them mean something today. And with everything I'd uncovered, I realized something vital. I wasn't the one under scrutiny anymore. The HOA was. Malene had been pushing like she held the script, but the courthouse whispered a different play entirely. The script wasn't hers to write. If the courthouse gave me the ammunition, then the survey would be the rifle to fire it clean through their lies. Deeds and dusty records were enough for lawyers, but nothing silences bluster like numbers with GPS precision. That's why Thursday morning I was on the phone at dawn with Jim, a licensed surveyor who'd been charting boundaries in this county since the 1990s. His reputation was simple. Once he logged a reading, judges nodded, lawyers folded, and neighbors shut their mouths. "Wes, I'll bring the full kit," Jim promised. "By tonight you'll have hard coordinates no one can dispute." At 3 sharp, his truck rattled down the gravel, piled high with gear that looked more suited for a NASA launch than a pasture walk. GPS receivers, laser scanners, buried marker detectors, laptops flashing maps. We started at my grandfather's oak tree, the same oak cited in the 1952 deed. Its trunk so wide 3 grown men couldn't wrap it, roots sunk like anchors. Jim placed the tripod, checked the coordinates, and let out a low whistle. "This matches your legal description from 70 years ago within inches. Your grandfather picked markers that outlive us all." We spent hours circling the boundary. The detector pinged again and again as we uncovered original iron stakes, still lodged deep where county surveyors had hammered them in decades earlier. Rusted but stamped with the official seal of 1952. Each one confirmed my suspicion. Malene wasn't fighting ambiguous lines. She was trampling on markers that had outlasted her lifetime of legal theatrics. But Jim's final calculation stunned even me. He dusted off his notepad, rechecked the figures, and looked up. That decorative community entrance up the road, pillars, landscaping, and the mailbox cluster, sits on 1.2 acres of your property. For a moment I just blinked, the weight of it sinking in. They hadn't just tried to find me illegally. They'd actually built their subdivision's gateway on my land without permission. Jim ran the numbers like an accountant. Fair rental value for that land would be around $700 a month. Multiply that by 8 years since the entrance went up. You're looking at $67,000 in unpaid use. And that doesn't include drainage problems from the excavation work. You've got significant legal leverage here, Wes. The kind that makes boards panic. Leverage. That was the word echoing in my chest as Jim packed up his gear and promised a full certified report ready for court. It wasn't just about resisting Malene anymore. It was about exposing how deeply flawed and fraudulent this whole system had become. Before I could even catch my breath from that revelation, another visitor showed up at the fence line. Rebecca Shaw, a neighbor I'd seen in passing but never spoken with at length, walked over carrying a heavy manila folder. A CPA, mid-40s, sharp in the eyes, the kind of person who reads details others skim. She introduced herself quietly, almost conspiratorially. "I heard you're digging into property rights. Well, I've been digging into something else. The HOA's books. You might need to see this." We spread her documents across my picnic table. It was worse than I expected. Her spreadsheets highlighted nearly $90,000 in expenditures with no proper authorization. Payments signed directly by Malene, bypassing required board votes. Invoices for safety lighting and landscaping improvements with no supporting contracts or competitive bids. One line item made my jaw tighten. $47,000 billed for the community entrance project. Yes, the one Jim had just proven was illegally built on my land. Rushed through without board approval. Rebecca pointed to notes she had scrawled in the margins. The bylaws state any expenditure over $5,000 requires full board approval. But Malene's been treating herself like a one-woman government, authorizing anything she wants. Some of us suspected foul play, but she intimidates people, calls emergency meetings without notice, falsifies minutes, punishes anyone who asks questions with fines. She's built fear into governance. But she's sloppy, and I've kept receipts. I leaned back, staring at the folder like it was dynamite. Because that's what it was. Financial proof of systematic abuse. Fraud stacks thick enough to bury anyone who pretended it was community oversight. That's when the pieces clicked together. The illegal fine, the measuring tape stunt at my fence, the overnight vandalism of survey markers. The HOA wasn't fighting me to keep order. They were overextending wildly to cover up a history of mistakes, encroachments, and financial abuses. In trying to intimidate me, they had cracked open their own vault of corruption. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder before closing her folder. "Look, one board member, Tom Wilson, has been quietly documenting Malene's violations for months, but he's terrified of her retaliation. He's got copies of minutes and altered authorizations that would make your head spin. He just doesn't know if it's safe to come forward." Safe. That word hung in the air more than it should have in a neighborhood that was supposed to be about peaceful lawns and picket fences. But now I understood. Fear was her true currency, not bylaws. By sundown, I had everything spread across my kitchen table. Jim's survey notes proving land theft and unpaid rent, Rebecca's folder glowing with financial misconduct, and my courthouse records tracing Malene's pattern of overreach from Dallas to Green Valley. It all told one story. The HOA's power was built on sand. As I flipped through the evidence, my cattle lowed outside, waiting for their evening feed, grounding me in the reality of why this mattered. This wasn't just about fines or surveys or meeting minutes. This land, this family's legacy, had been here since 1952, and I wasn't about to let a red blazer bureaucrat with a clipboard rewrite that history. The HOA thought they'd cornered me with a $3,000 fine, but with what I now held in my hands, they were the ones about to be cornered, with $90,000 worth of fraud, $67,000 in unpaid rent, and one hell of a reckoning coming their way. By the end of that week, I thought I had the upper hand. The survey numbers, deed copies, financial spreadsheets. But cornered animals don't lie still, they bite. And Malene Pierce, stripped of calm authority, was about to bare her teeth. The first blow came one chilly morning as I rolled out with feed for the cattle. I found a heavy chain stretched across the access road. My family's road, grandfather cut in '52, worn by cattle trucks for 3 generations. Now sealed shut with industrial padlocks, bright signs zip-tied to it. Emergency safety closure, by order of HOA Compliance Department. I stood with my thermos in hand, staring at the absurdity, rage simmering under control. The feed truck driver braked behind me, climbing down in disbelief. "Mr. Carter, I've got 2,000 pounds sitting here I can't unload. That's $340 a day if it spoils." His exasperation lit the calculation already forming in my head. Damages, losses, interference, every dollar more evidence. The cattle bawled at the blocked road, heads bobbing in confusion. You don't disrupt creature routine without consequence. By afternoon, the herd was restless, digestive cycles thrown off, older ones showing signs of stress. I called Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the ranch vet, who examined the herd and shook her head. Disrupted feed patterns lead to weight loss, digestive issues, immune vulnerability. Stress now becomes dollars out of your pocket 6 months from now when sale day comes. She documented every symptom, every behavior, adding grimly, "This isn't just wrong, Wes, it's cruel." I snapped photos of the chained gate, the confused herd, the spoiled feed, each click sealing proof of calculated sabotage. Sheriff Lewis arrived as the sun arced lower, his cruiser's light bar off, his expression visibly hard when he saw the blockade. He photographed it himself, speaking low. "This isn't compliance, Wes, this is criminal mischief. Interference with legal business operations. Maybe even animal cruelty, depending how far they let this go." He took sworn statements from the feed supplier and the veterinarian, promising his report would be going straight to the district attorney. If Malene thought cutting off my livelihood would break me, she'd miscalculated. What she had done was hand me clear damages in dollars and livestock health, but the retaliation didn't stop at chains. 2 days later, I drove to the County Planning Bureau to confirm what a neighbor had hinted at: new permit filings. Diana Rodriguez, the county planner, laid them across a table. 8 years' worth of applications, all listing my property with HOA authorization signatures, landscaping, lighting, drainage modifications. Even the decorative community entrance Jim's survey proved was illegally built on my acreage. Each file lacked the required landowner consent. Each one was fraud on official stationery. Diana leaned back, eyes wide. "Mr. Carter, this is systematic permit fraud, felony level if supported by further evidence. You've been the victim here, not the violator." That declaration from an official rang louder than any sheriff's cruiser siren. For months, Malene had tried to paint me as the problem. Instead, county files proved she and her cronies were the fraudsters. Meanwhile, cracks were forming inside her own walls. Rebecca whispered that Tom Wilson, a shy numbers man on the board, had been quietly documenting Malene's overreach for months. He'd been too afraid to confront her. Until now. One evening, a note slid under my front door in shaky handwriting. "Board meeting tomorrow night. Vote to remove Malene. She doesn't know about Tom's evidence file." My gut told me someone inside was finally ready to flip. By Wednesday night, I attended the emergency board session at the community center, looming in the back as a silent observer. The room crackled with tension. Rebecca sat with her financial folder, Tom pale at the board table, documents trembling in his hand. Malene, in her crimson blazer, tried to strike the old imperious posture, but her eyes fluttered too quickly around the room. Her voice cracked as she declared, "All actions taken by the compliance department are within standards. The mediator, brought in by the county, asked for credentials." Malene produced faded Dallas certificates. Expired municipal code enforcement papers, not HOA qualifications. The revelation was devastating. Expired for 2 years, meaningless in the current context. Murmurs spread through the crowd like embers catching dry grass. That's when Tom stood. He shook but didn't falter. "I've documented everything," he said, unfolding a file thick with receipts, altered minutes, forged signatures. His voice grew steadier as he read, $47,000 on the entrance project without board vote. Emergency meetings manufactured to justify spending. Fines issued without evidence. It was 8 months of abuse bound in paper and courage. For once, Malene had no words. She stammered, turned red, barked about complexities of community management. But the board, once cowed, raised hands. 3 voted to suspend her. 2 clung to fear. The numbers didn't finish her, but the crack was wide. The room buzzed. Residents who had once shuffled nervously now stood to share testimonies. Mrs. Patterson spoke of flower fines. The Johnsons recalled their children's slide ordered removed. A man on Oak Street trembled with anger, recounting deck fees he'd already cleared with the county. Every story layered like bricks around Malene's crumbling walls. She stormed out before the vote finalized, red blazer flaring. But out in the parking lot, as I headed to my truck, she intercepted me. No scripts left, eyes hollow. "Mr. Carter, there are things about this dispute you don't understand. Meet me tomorrow privately. There's something I need to show you." The power-drunk compliance chair was gone. In her place was something fragile, desperate, maybe repentant. but I'd seen too much to trust easily. That night I paced under my grandfather's oak, cattle lowing in the dark pastures wondering what tomorrow held. A trap or a confession. Either way, the board had cracked. And once cracks form, walls collapse. The next afternoon, the scene inside my own kitchen didn't feel like a battlefield anymore, but like a kind of reckoning. Malene arrived without her trademark red blazer, wearing jeans and a plain shirt, her posture no longer that of an enforcer but of a woman cornered by her own choices. Sheriff Lewis sat quietly at the table as a neutral witness, while I spread the documents across the wood surface. The survey proving their subdivision stole 1.2 acres of my land, Rebecca's accounting folder exposing $90,000 in unauthorized spending, the county planner's files detailing 8 years of fraudulent permit applications. Piece by piece, I laid out a mosaic she could not deny. Finally, with eyes lowered, she admitted what I had already discovered. Her termination from Dallas wasn't administrative. It was disciplinary, born of improper citations and unauthorized fines that cost innocent families their savings. She confessed that in Green Valley she had doubled down, overcompensating with intimidation to mask her fear of failure. She listed every abuse: emergency meetings staged without notice, fines issued without evidence, survey markers pulled in darkness, access road chained to starve cattle, and for the first time, without theatrics, she owned her actions. What emerged wasn't the defiant compliance officer screaming through my fence, but a broken official desperate for absolution. Sheriff Lewis listened, expression steady, then said words that turned this moment from punishment into possibility. Justice isn't just about payment, it's about prevention. That became the path forward. Instead of dragging this into endless courtrooms, we forged a mediated settlement rooted in restitution, education, and reform. Malene agreed to structured payments covering damages, $67,000 in back rent for the 1.2 acres her HOA entrance had stolen, compensation for the chained access that caused livestock stress, reimbursement of legal and survey expenses, plus rescinding the $3,000 fine she had waived at my gate. Altogether, nearly $120,000 in restitution, not punitive damages but calculated payback for real harm. But the most important part was not financial. She agreed to undergo updated HOA management accreditation, attend courses on rural property rights and agricultural law, and provide training to other compliance officers, turning her blunders into case studies. Sheriff Lewis oversaw that this wasn't mere avoidance of charges, but rehabilitation through accountability. Meanwhile, the HOA itself underwent overhaul. Rebecca chaired a newly formed oversight committee. Tom Wilson stepped into leadership with newfound courage, and residents, emboldened by what they had seen, demanded transparency. New bylaws mandated open financial records, board votes recorded and published, and proper procedures enforced not by intimidation, but by informed consent. For the first time in years, Green Valley was free from fear of the red blazer and clipboard. As for me, silence had been my greatest weapon, and it turned out restraint had accomplished more than retaliation ever could. 3 weeks later, the ranch looked different, not because of new fences or legal documents, but because of laughter, neighbors unloading crockpots for a community barbecue, children chasing each other beneath the same oak my grandfather had marked 3 generations earlier. A new trailhead sign unveiled with care. The Carter Williams Heritage Trail dedicated to Frank Williams, the absentee landowner whose name had been falsely erased by HOA greed, but was now restored in bronze. The money Evelyn once siphoned into her vanity projects had been redirected into a scholarship fund for ethics and civic leadership at the local high school, a fitting reminder that from corruption could grow lessons for the next generation. Sheriff Lewis grilled burgers while joking with families. Rebecca handed out flyers for the first property rights workshop. And for the first time I saw Malene, quietly placing her dish on a potluck table, blending into the crowd without command or clipboard, learning as any neighbor should. The night closed with lanterns bobbing above the pasture, fireflies mingling with the laughter of people who had once been silent out of fear but were now speaking, sharing, organizing. Looking across my land, from the oak tree to the entrance still wet with new paint where my survey markers once hid, I realized the fight had come full circle. They had tried to make me a villain for protecting my rights. Instead, I had forced them to respect what had been true since 1952. This land, this legacy, was ours. And in defending it, we hadn't just stopped corruption. We'd built something stronger, a living community finally free to breathe.